In America, there is a correlation between dump sites and the homes of poor and minorities. The major question seems to be, is environmental protection a priority for the wealthy or an irrelevant one for the poor? There are economic, sociopolitical, and racial factors to take into account when considering dump sites. All three play a role when it comes time for a new dump site to be built or who lives in the neighborhoods near them. The correlation between poor and minority neighborhoods and dump sites is due to disproportionate representation in Congress, hegemony, and drive for achieving the American dream. First, I need to answer the chicken or the egg concept of environmental justice. Was the waste site dumped in poor neighborhoods, or were dump sites already established and poor people were the only ones who could move into the nearby neighborhoods? Erickson concluded that waste facilities were placed into poor neighborhoods because low-income communities were seen as the path of least resistance. The lower-income demographic has fewer resources and political influences to oppose unwanted dump sites in their backyard. However, there was a demographic change after dump sites were installed. After waste sites were built near neighborhoods where affluent whites had already been moving out, the poor minority residents started to move in even before the dump site was built. There was still change to the demographic of neighborhoods after a plant is installed. The three main reasons why waste is dumped near poor minority neighborhoods are economic factors, sociopolitical factors, and racial factors. Economic factors stem from cheap land obtained by the dump site contractors. The contractors want to minimize production costs by building new facilities on the cheapest land possible. Coincidentally, this may also be where low-income families and minorities also find the cheapest housing. Once dump site facilities have developed, it may cause a decline in property value and a quality of life around that area. Affluent whites who were taking up residence in that area are now motivated to move away, increasing housing affordability in that neighborhood. This makes the American dream a trick. Everyone strives to live the American dream, defined by material things and achievement. Achieving prominent productivity thus creates capitalism. Big houses in nice neighborhoods is part of that dream. Living in rich white neighborhoods could be the highest achievement. When white flight begins out of a neighborhood, and thus decreasing property values, it makes homes more affordable for the poor and minorities. They now think that they have achieved the American dream. But the reality is that their new neighborhood property values will plummet. More and more people will begin to move in and keep driving that value of the neighborhood down, not to mention that there is a dump site in their backyard. In Washington, D.C., there is a clear line on the map between rich and poor, and African American and white. The Potomac River is a separating line where rich white lives in the west and poor African Americans live in the east. Data from the 1990 census shows that the east was not as poor as it is today and populated with more whites. There are at least 3 dump sites in and surrounding the poor community today, which drove down property values and caused a massive white flight to the west and even further into suburbs. Where the whites used to live in the east was a nicer part of Washington, D.C. Once dump sites were installed, the rich moved away and property values declined. The poor African Americans moved in and probably thought they had achieved the American dream, but today these neighborhoods mostly house the poor residents of D.C. Sociopolitical factors that cause dump sites in poor areas are because of an imbalance in political power. Poor minority communities have fewer resources to vote one of their own onto the board and decide where dump sites will be built. Even if they don't have a representative that lives in the conditions they do, their representatives care less about them than other more affluent and white areas. They are unable to lobby to keep unwanted land uses and dump sites being built near their homes. Even without government intending to place dump sites near poor areas, whites have a not in my backyard mentality, and therefore disproportionate placement of dump sites surrounding poor neighborhoods. There has been disinvestment in many of the poor inner cities where waste sites are located. White flight has created racial and economic segregation, which has limited inner-city development, created cheap land, and promoted the use and development on cheap land for dumping. Underrepresentation of the poor communities in Congress leaves the poor at the hands of the rich. To be elected into office, you have to have money and an education. The poor often have neither. Without an education, they also don't know how to lobby and get the government to listen to them. The poor can do nothing where dump sites are placed, and the rich, who decide the laws and the location of dump sites, will pick the cheapest land to save overall cost. Minorities are underrepresented in government and are the last to pick where they want unwanted dump sites. Racial factors are the third reason for poor minorities living near dump sites. An overwhelming number of minorities, namely African Americans and Hispanics, are in poverty. Race plays a role in where certain people can get homes. Housing segregation limits where minorities can get homes and imprison them from moving away from the poor neighborhoods. They can't break the constraints set by their limited incomes. Minorities have become the path of least resistance by the government when it comes to new and unwanted facilities. Hegemony plays a role in where different groups of people live. Laws, policies, and board of directors for dumps are run by the elite class. They are the powerful ones who decide who to place the dumps. The rich purposely want to keep the poor away from their homes. The poor just accept the fact that they will live near dumps. There is no rioting from the lower class because it is accepted as law even though it does not benefit them. The most powerful type of leader is a legal rationale because it is external to oneself. The rich make the laws and everyone obeys, rich and poor, but the rich make the laws to keep the poor in poverty. Poor school districts are often placed near dumps. Schools are built on cheap land to save money, and cheap land can always be found near dump sites. The parents of school districts don't know any better and just assume that's life, while the rich school districts are placed in the middle of the nice neighborhoods far away from dumps. The rich schools have parents who are on the board of directors or other powerful positions and have a say where their children go to school. In Memphis, Tennessee, there were 12 schools within 1 mile of Defense Depot, a large city dump. The surrounding neighborhood was predominantly poor and African American. Pollutants in the air within these schools included lead, arsenic, mercury, and PCBs, which are all known to cause cancer, developmental, and neurological disorders. 44% of white students attended schools in the highest polluted tenth of the geographic tract. 82% of African Americans and 62% of Latinos were also enrolled in these schools. The academic outcome of going to a polluted schools are poor attendance rates and academic performance. The poor will forever be trapped in a cycle of poverty. The wealthy pass laws to prevent the poor from breaking the glass ceiling and achieving the American dream. Once the poor think they have moved up and are out of poverty, their neighborhoods degrade to poor again because of declining property values. Disproportionate representation in Congress and on boards makes it even more difficult for those in poverty to have a say within government. Money and education is how American politicians are elected, and poor people don't necessarily have money or an education. After being elected, the poor and minorities blindly follow the rules made by the rich. Hegemony keeps the poor in poverty. The poor and minorities will always get the more unfavorable conditions because the rich make the rules.